A Hamas courier stepped into a luxury hotel in Jordan, carrying a briefcase stuffed with cash and fake passports. He felt untouchable there. He was sure that Jordan's ban on Israeli intelligence work made the place a kind of shelter. But that belief lasted less than 2 days. In under 48 hours, Mossad had picked him out from the crowd, followed every move he made, mapped the people he worked with, and pushed him into becoming one of their most useful sources. The way they did it was so quiet and so careful that Hamas never understood how the whole thing slipped through their fingers. What follows is the account of a surveillance job carried out with unusual precision. Mossad had to follow a single courier through a city where they were not supposed to run any operation at all. They leaned on hotel employees who had no idea who they were helping. They used security cameras that were already in place. And they managed to pull off one tense, dangerous, face-to-face talk that changed the courier's life. That one conversation shifted him from a loyal Hamas operative to a man feeding information to Israeli intelligence. From that point on, the intel he passed along helped shut down several planned attacks and exposed how Hamas moved money across the Middle East. The strangest part is simple. He agreed. After Mossad confronted him and laid out everything they had gathered, he faced a choice that could either buy him a future or get him killed immediately. He ended up choosing the side he had grown up seeing as his enemy. To understand how it reached that point, go back to the year 2003. The Second Intifada had been tearing through the region for 3 years. Israeli cities were hit again and again. Suicide bombers were walking into crowded streets, blowing up buses, hitting small restaurants and cafes. Hundreds of civilians were dying. Much of this violence traced back to Hamas. They were pulling in volunteers for suicide missions, preparing bombs, and organizing attacks from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But they were also running parts of their network from outside Israel, in places where Israeli intelligence had little freedom to operate. One of those places was Jordan. Jordan's position toward Israel has always been layered. On paper, Jordan and Israel have a peace treaty. They keep formal diplomatic ties. Their security agencies talk when they need to. The Jordanian government does not want Hamas setting up operations in their country because it drags them into trouble with Israel and makes them look friendly to terror groups. At the same time, Jordan has a large Palestinian population, and many people there feel connected to the Palestinian struggle. The General Intelligence Directorate, known as the GI, has to walk a thin line. They need to keep the peace with Israel, but they also cannot be seen as too close to them or they risk angering their own people. This creates an odd space.
Mossad is not supposed to act on Jordanian soil. If they are caught running agents or surveillance there, the Jordanian government must speak out against them, even if behind closed doors they may tolerate a limited amount of activity. Hamas is fully aware of this gap. They treat Jordan as a practical transit zone where the risk of Israeli interference is lower. They move money through Jordanian banks. They route couriers across Jordanian cities. Weapons pass through Jordanian territory on their way to other fronts. In that gray space, the courier thought he could operate freely. He assumed the briefcase of cash and forged documents meant nothing to anyone outside Hamas. He assumed the hotel in Jordan gave him cover. But Mossad saw him, followed him, learned his patterns, and then turned him. And with that single shift, the entire network he supported began to unravel. Operatives from different cells would slip into cities across Jordan to map out plans for future attacks. Couriers, the people who carried cash, notes, and simple instructions between Hamas units, kept using Jordan as a main stopover because they were convinced no one was watching them there. In the early months of 2003, Israeli intelligence began to notice a pattern. Intercepted messages pointed to Hamas moving significant amounts of money through Amman, the capital of Jordan. And they were doing it without touching banks. Banks would have created records that could expose the whole system. Instead, they relied on couriers walking around with bundles of cash. That cash kept their operations alive. It covered payments to the families of suicide bombers. It paid for explosives and other supplies. It supported the network that kept Hamas functioning across several regions. If Mossad could figure out who these couriers were and follow the routes they used, they could break the financial chain Hamas depended on. They could stop attacks before anyone was harmed and uncover operatives who had never appeared on Israeli radar. But there was a real obstacle. Trying to pick out a single courier in a crowded city of 2 million people was almost impossible. Running surveillance openly wasn't an option. Any mistake inside Jordan could turn into a political crisis. Mossad needed something small, anything that pointed them in the right direction. A name, a location, a routine. That break came from someone no one expected. During a raid in the West Bank, Israeli forces captured a Hamas member who handled basic logistics. This person wasn't important in the hierarchy. They weren't a strategist or a commander. But during questioning by Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, they mentioned one detail. Couriers often met in a specific high-end hotel in Amman. They didn't know the exact name, they only knew the place was pricey and close to the diplomatic area. It wasn't much to go on. Amman had many upscale hotels and several fit that vague description.
Still, it was more than Mossad had before. They began checking which hotels in the diplomatic district were usually filled with Arab business travelers. Couriers wouldn't want to stand out in a place full of Western tourists. They needed a setting where wealthy Arab guests were common, where no one would look twice at them. After some analysis, Mossad narrowed the list to 3 5-star hotels, all in the right area and all known for hosting Arab business clients. The next step was figuring out which one Hamas used without sending agents into Amman. A physical presence carried too much risk. So they turned to technical surveillance. Mossad had a unit skilled at gathering information from afar. They could watch security systems, listen to communications, and collect data without sending a single operative across the border. They began monitoring the security feeds for all 3 hotels, doing it in a way that kept them completely out of sight, avoiding any direct access that could expose their operation. They didn't need to force their way into the hotels. They just pulled the digital video streams while they were moving through the system. Back then, most hotel security setups had no real protection. Cameras pushed footage to a security room, and during that short hop, anyone with the right gear and enough technical skill could grab the signal. Mossad did exactly that. They tapped the feeds from all 3 hotels and began watching everything in real time. They weren't hunting for dramatic scenes. They wanted routine behavior that looked slightly off. People checking in for short stays. Folks meeting several others in the lobby, even though they claimed to be tourists. Guests who never seemed interested in the city and treated the hotel like an office. They monitored this for 2 months straight, no breaks. They tagged faces, logged movements, and used facial recognition to follow anyone who reappeared across different locations. They flagged people who kept showing up at more than one hotel or who met the same contacts again and again. Bit by bit, they filled a database with these small patterns. One hotel stood out, the Grand Continental Amman. The name isn't exact, but close enough. This place kept pulling the same type of guest. Someone would arrive, stay 1 or 2 nights, meet a few others in the lobby or restaurant for about an hour, then leave separately. The main guest would check out the next morning like nothing happened. Different faces, same routine. After Mossad ran their facial recognition on these visitors, the links became clear. Some had appeared at Palestinian solidarity events, some traveled often to Syria and Lebanon, places where Hamas kept offices. A few had relatives tied to Hamas members. The pattern wasn't vague anymore. The Grand Continental Amman was a quiet meeting hub for Hamas logistics work. Now Mossad had to find one person, a courier they could follow and maybe turn.
Someone who made these runs often, who Hamas trusted enough to handle money or messages, but not high-ranking enough for his absence to spark panic. So they kept the feeds rolling. In June 2003, they saw someone who fit. A man in his early 30s checked in at the Grand Continental. He was Palestinian, but with a Jordanian passport. Mossad ran his travel record and saw he'd visited Amman 4 times in the past 6 months, always at the same hotel, always for 1 or 2 nights. His name isn't something I can use here, so I'll call him Khalil, but the events are real. Khalil wasn't a fighter or a field commander. He worked in the background. His job was to move money and messages from one Hamas network to another. He picked up cash in one place, crossed borders quietly, and handed it off somewhere else. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the organization running. Hamas liked people like him because they didn't stand out. No criminal history, no arrests, nothing that would raise suspicion during normal checks. He ran a real import-export business, and that gave him a clean excuse to move through border security all the time. To anyone watching casually, he came off as an ordinary businessman moving from place to place. But Mossad's surveillance teams had already tagged him as a courier. Their next step was to confirm it and figure out the safest way to get close to him. They kept eyes on him during his whole stay in Amman. He arrived on a Thursday night and checked in without drawing attention. Early Friday morning, he met another man in the hotel restaurant. They sat together for roughly an hour and a half. Security cameras caught the two of them locked in a serious discussion, with the other man now and then sliding papers across the table for Khalil to review. When the meal was over, they split up and headed in different directions. Khalil returned to his room and stayed there for most of the day, leaving only that evening to eat alone in the same restaurant. By the next morning, he was gone. He checked out, grabbed a taxi, and went straight to the airport. Mossad tracked his movements and confirmed which flight he boarded. He flew to Beirut, in Lebanon. That detail mattered. Beirut was a central hub for Hamas, a place where much of their political planning and financial activity was managed. His arrival there told Mossad that he wasn't just a minor courier. He might be tied into something bigger. Now the service had a hard choice. They could stay in the shadows and keep watching him, using his movements and contacts to map the wider courier chain. Or they could try to recruit him. That option carried far more risk, but also much more upside. If they managed to flip him and make him a double agent, he could feed them fresh intel as it happened. He could show where funds were being routed. He could point out other operatives. He could help trace plots before they turned into real attacks. But getting close to him was dangerous.
If he turned down the approach, he would report it straight to Hamas. Hamas would assume the whole network was blown and rewrite all their procedures. They would freeze operations, shut their channels, and start hunting for whoever had leaked. And even if Khalil agreed to help, Mossad had to consider the chance he might fake it, pretend to cooperate, and push false information back at them. That kind of misdirection could ruin their operations and lead to deaths. So they needed to be certain about him. They needed one clear pressure point, some part of his life that made him vulnerable, a reason he might turn on Hamas. They built a full picture of his background. They followed his money through quiet channels. They monitored his calls and messages. They looked at everyone in his family circle. They searched for anything that could tilt him toward cooperation. What they found was simple but powerful. Khalil had a younger brother living in the West Bank. The brother had no ties to Hamas at all. He was just trying to get by under Israeli control, working as a teacher, raising a family with his wife and their 2 children. And here was the key detail. The brother had applied for a permit to receive medical treatment in Israel.
He suffered from a serious condition that needed surgery unavailable in local Palestinian hospitals. The Israeli officials handling the permit had marked the file because of the link to Khalil, who by then was on Mossad's watch list. The request moved slowly through layers of review, stuck in a process that could end either way. It might get approved, or it might get rejected. And if it ended in rejection, his brother would miss the treatment he needed. That gave Mossad a clear opening. They could use the stalled permit as pressure. By stepping in and smoothing things out inside the medical and security system, they could more or less save the man's life. In return, they wanted Khalil to cooperate. But they couldn't move too fast. A direct call or blunt offer would look strange and would probably scare him off. They needed him to feel that they understood every part of his situation, that they had reach, and that working with them was the safest path forward. So they put together a plan to approach him the next time he visited Amman. And in August 2003, surveillance showed he had booked another stay at the Grand Continental. That was the moment they had been waiting for. They intended to make contact during that trip, but the same problem remained. They couldn't run an overt operation in Jordan. Sending Israeli officers into Amman risked getting caught by Jordanian intelligence, which would have led to a serious diplomatic mess. Because of that, they chose a false flag approach. That meant the person who contacted Khalil would pretend to represent some other organization, keeping Mossad's identity hidden until it was too late for him to back away.
They sent in one operative, not Israeli, someone carrying a European passport and with no ties that pointed back to Israel. The cover story was simple: a consultant for a private security company that did work for several governments across the Middle East. The agent arrived at the Grand Continental 2 days before Khalil. They walked the halls, learned the layout, checked where the cameras were, and noted the blind spots. They chose the spot where the first conversation would take place. When Khalil finally checked in, the agent didn't rush toward him. They waited and watched. They studied his schedule and looked for a moment when he would be alone, but not on guard. That chance came on his second night in Amman. After dinner, he headed to the hotel bar. He sat by himself, ordered coffee, and scrolled through his phone. He didn't drink alcohol, and he looked like a man settling in for a quiet hour. The agent took a nearby table and let a few minutes pass. Then they started a simple conversation, nothing pointed. They introduced themselves under their cover identity and mentioned that they worked in security. They asked if Khalil was in Amman for business. He said he was, offering almost no detail. They kept up an easy exchange for maybe 20 minutes. It felt like the kind of chat two travelers might have when they end up in the same quiet corner of a hotel bar. The agent stayed calm, polite, and gave no hint that this was anything more than coincidence. When the talk was almost over, the agent dropped a line that shifted the whole mood. They mentioned, like it was nothing, that they had seen Khalil check into this same hotel several times during the past year. They added that noticing patterns like that came with their line of work, since security was part of what they handled every day. Khalil tensed up right away. He pressed them on how they could possibly know where he had stayed before. The agent gave a small, calm smile and said they had access to a mix of internal systems, hotel files, and travel databases. It was clear now that this exchange hadn't started by chance. Someone had been watching him for a while. Then the agent said they wanted to bring up a business matter, not out in the open, not in the noise of the bar, but in a quieter place. They suggested meeting in the agent's hotel room in about half an hour. Khalil had to decide fast. He could walk away, alert Hamas, change his routines, and never set foot in this hotel again. Or he could go upstairs and figure out what this stranger really wanted. He chose to go. Maybe it was fear. Maybe curiosity.
Maybe he already sensed that turning them down might carry its own risks. Half an hour later, he stood at the agent's door and knocked. The next 2 hours, according to declassified material and accounts from people close to the operation, unfolded in a way that left him with fewer and fewer choices. The agent didn't start by naming Mossad.
They opened with something simpler and heavier: proof. They laid out photos of Khalil from earlier visits to the hotel. They showed logs matching his meetings with other Hamas figures. They set out documents that mapped his travel routes. They even knew how much cash he had brought in and out of the country. They explained that they served an organization, still unnamed, that watched Hamas's finances closely. They knew he carried money. They knew he moved funds tied to violent missions. Khalil tried to brush it all off. He said he was only a businessman, that the people he met were just partners, that nothing he did had anything to do with anything illegal. The agent didn't argue. They simply let him speak until he ran out of excuses. Then they brought more: intercepted calls, financial papers showing strange cash movements, statements from detained Hamas members who had pointed to Khalil by name. At that point, he understood they weren't guessing. They had the whole picture. Denial wouldn't save him. That was when the agent laid out his choices: 3 paths. The first was simple. He could refuse to work with them. If he did, they'd hand every piece of evidence to Jordanian intelligence. Jordan would arrest him on terrorism charges. He'd face a long stretch in a Jordanian prison. Hamas wouldn't step in, because stepping in would mean admitting they operated on Jordanian soil, and that would create a political mess they weren't willing to face. Option 2 ran through his head again. He could bolt, get out of Amman fast, cut all ties, and hope distance would solve things. But he knew it wouldn't. They would hunt him in any place he tried to hide. They would label him a liability and feed that to Hamas, and Hamas would almost certainly see that as grounds to kill him for being compromised. Option 3 sounded even worse, yet it was the only one that wasn't fatal on the spot. He could play along, work with them, keep doing everything he did before, and pass along whatever he learned. In return, they said they would shield him, pay him enough to matter, and take care of his family. Then the agent shifted to something far more personal. Khalil's brother, the one who needed treatment that the authorities kept delaying. The agent said they had ties inside the Israeli system. They could push the paperwork through. They could get the medical permit approved. They could keep the kid alive. That was the moment Khalil finally understood what was happening. This wasn't a private outfit or some freelance operator. This was Israeli intelligence, most likely Mossad, sitting across from him and offering him a lifeline and a noose at the same time. He asked straight out, "Are you Israeli?" The agent didn't confirm, didn't deny. They only said that the people behind them had the weight to make all those promises real. And if Khalil agreed, the medical permit would be cleared within 1 week. Khalil didn't speak for a long while. He just sat there, staring down, breathing slow, trying to think his way through something that had no good ending. If he refused, his brother would die, and Hamas would almost surely punish him for even being suspected. If he agreed, he would break faith with the group he had served for years, the cause he had once trusted. Either way, someone would bleed. At last he asked what exactly they expected. The agent laid it out plainly. Khalil would keep doing his courier work as if nothing had shifted. Hamas could not sense even a hint of change. But every meeting, every bundle of cash, every detail about operations, targets, movements, he would pass to his new handlers. They would speak only through encrypted channels. They would prepare dead drops in places no one would notice. There would be no face-to-face meetings unless things absolutely demanded it. And for that, he would be compensated. Not some lavish payout, but enough to help his family stay afloat. His brother would get real treatment, not promises. And when the situation became too dangerous,
They would move him out and rebuild his identity somewhere far from all this. So Khalil agreed. Not with passion, not with loyalty, but because survival left him only one path. He chose the option that at least offered his family a future. The agent handed him a phone, a specific model loaded with encrypted tools. They walked him through the basics: how to send a secure message, how to make contact if something went wrong, how to erase everything quickly. Then they gave him a code phrase. If he ever needed to abort a mission or warn them he was compromised, he would send that phrase and they would extract him. Before leaving, the agent told him to exit the hotel alone, return to his room, act like nothing unusual had happened, finish his current job for Hamas. When he reached home, his first instructions would arrive on the encrypted device. Khalil got up, walked out, and went back to his room in silence. He likely stared at the ceiling until morning, knowing his life had already shifted into something he couldn't undo. He had just agreed to work as a spy for the very people his own group saw as the worst possible enemy. If Hamas ever learned what he had done, they would drag him in, break him apart for answers, and then kill him without hesitation. Still, he had likely saved his brother's life, and in a way, he had given himself a chance to live too. The following morning, Khalil walked out of the hotel as if nothing unusual had happened. He followed the plan he had laid out days earlier. He boarded a flight to Beirut, carried out the delivery he had been assigned, and handed over the money he was transporting. His Hamas contacts gave him a fresh set of tasks. He then returned to his place in Jordan and tried to settle back into his routine. About 1 week later, his brother was told that his medical permit had gone through. He was allowed to travel to Israel for the surgery he needed.
The operation was booked for the next month. To Khalil, this was clear proof that the Israelis had stuck to their promise, and that meant he had to keep his promise as well. During the next 2 years, Khalil turned into one of Mossad's most valuable informants inside the financial side of Hamas. He sent detailed reports on the ways money moved, the routes it followed, and the people involved in shifting it across borders. He pointed out other couriers, described the facilitators who kept the system running, and recounted meetings where upcoming attacks were discussed. His information shaped several operations. Israeli teams blocked transfers that would have paid for suicide bombings. They uncovered Hamas cells preparing violent actions and arrested the members before they acted. They traced weapon shipments and seized them long before the cargo reached Gaza. But Mossad could not simply use everything he passed along. If they acted on every tip, Hamas would notice patterns, start digging, and eventually land on Khalil. So the Israelis used only the most urgent pieces, details tied to attacks that were close to being carried out, major funds that would fuel operations, or individuals considered high priority. The rest stayed filed away, saved for later analysis. When Mossad did act, they built cover stories to hide the real source. If they stopped a large transfer, they claimed the lead came from surveillance or intercepted signals. If they detained Hamas members, they said it came from routine sweeps rather than a specific tip. These layers of explanation kept Khalil safe. No one inside Hamas imagined that someone in their own career chain was quietly passing information to the other side. Meanwhile, Khalil lived with constant pressure. Each time he sat with Hamas contacts, he had to look steady, speak calmly, and pretend loyalty while knowing he was giving their secrets away. Every sum he moved became a report he sent to Mossad. Any call, any meeting, any errand could expose him. He was paid for the risks he took, but the money sat in a secure account he could not touch. Mossad didn't want him suddenly appearing richer, which would draw attention. The funds would reach him only after he was extracted and given a new identity. Khalil's brother eventually underwent the surgery in Israel. The operation went well. He healed, returned to his life in the West Bank, and never learned that his treatment had been tied to an intelligence deal that had changed his brother's life forever. By 2005, Khalil had already spent 2 full years living a second life as a double agent. In that time, he had passed on steady streams of intelligence that stopped more than one planned attack and helped Israeli teams break apart key parts of Hamas's money network. The work was valuable, but it was wearing him down. He felt it in small slips he never used to make. He moved a little slower, checked things with a little less care.
Mossad handlers picked up on this during their secure talks. They could hear the pressure in his voice and see it in his behavior patterns. They understood that sooner or later he would make a big mistake, and Hamas would notice. So they started shaping an exit plan. They would lift him out of his old life entirely and send him somewhere quiet under a new name. But the extraction never got the chance to roll out cleanly. Something shifted inside Hamas. Its internal security group launched a review after spotting odd gaps in their financial system. They saw that several transfers over the past year had vanished into Israeli hands. They also saw that a few planned operations kept failing before they even began. At first, no one pointed to a mole. The simple explanation was that Israeli signal intercept teams had improved their reach. So Hamas staff changed their patterns. They switched to new encryption. They replaced old code words. They adjusted the way they handled secret messages and tightened every rule they had. Still, the same problem kept appearing. Israel somehow stayed a step ahead. That pushed Hamas toward a different line of thinking. If the leaks were not electronic, then they might be coming from a person. They opened a broad review of anyone with access to sensitive material. They looked at people who handled communications, at financial middlemen, at couriers who moved packets and messages. Khalil was one of the names on that list. Security officers began pulling files on him. They traced his travel routes. They dug into his bank activity. They contacted people who had met him through business. Nothing obvious came up. His import-export cover held together. His trips matched his supposed work. His income did not show strange spikes. Even so, a quiet doubt settled over them. In this kind of work, hard proof is not always needed. A hint of uncertainty can be enough to pull someone off active tasks while the truth is sorted out. Hamas informed Khalil that his courier duties were paused. They called it a routine review, something everyone in sensitive roles had to go through. They claimed it was not directed at him, but he understood the real signal. They were unsure of him, and they were now watching him closely. Sooner or later, they would either clear his name or decide he was the source of their problems. Khalil used his encrypted phone and pushed out an emergency note to his Mossad contacts. He explained that Hamas had frozen his work and opened an investigation into him. He asked to be pulled out right away. Mossad did not waste time. The extraction plan was already prepared. They only needed to move it forward. Their goal was simple: get Khalil out of Jordan and bring him into Israel before Hamas reached a final judgment on him. The problem was messy because Jordan and Israel shared a border, and crossing it the legal way meant paperwork that would sit in some file forever.
If Hamas ever checked why Khalil vanished, they would see he had entered Israel, and that alone would make him look like a spy. So there was no choice. He had to slip across without leaving a trail. Along the Jordan-Israel line, there were stretches that were barely watched. Long, empty desert where the terrain was rough, but a person could still get through if they knew what they were doing. Mossad had used those spots before. They told Khalil to drive to a point in the far south of Jordan, close to the border. They gave him a date and told him to reach the place at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. He stuck to the plan. When the night came, he took his car out and followed the lonely road until he reached the coordinates. Everything around him was quiet, just dry land and a few tired bushes. A single vehicle waited in the dark. Mossad officers were inside, having crossed over from the Israeli side. They had already cut power to a small section of the fence so they could move through quickly.
They brought night vision gear and radios to keep clear of both Jordanian patrols and Israeli units who were not supposed to see them. Khalil left his car, climbed into theirs, and they moved out. They slid through the temporary gap in the fence and kept driving deeper into Israel. About 90 minutes later, written out as 1 hour and 30 minutes, they were far past the border zone. No lights, no checkpoints, just open land behind them. They brought him to a safe house. He stayed there several days while Mossad questioned him. The officers asked for every detail he knew from the past 2 years, every meeting, every message, every financial pattern he had seen. They collected everything while he was finally out of danger. After the debriefing, they started building his new life, new identity, new name, new passport, a clean background. He took language lessons to get his English to a stronger level. They gave him enough money to set himself up somewhere far from the region. And then they moved him, not to Israel, which would have been too easy for Hamas to guess, but to a country in Europe. There he settled under his new identity and slowly faded from view. Back in Jordan, his family was told he had gone abroad for business and would be away for a while. When weeks turned into months, they assumed something had gone wrong. Maybe he had been detained. Maybe he had died. They never found out what actually happened. Hamas kept digging into the leak inside their financial network. In the end, they convinced themselves that Israel had broken into their signals rather than planted a human source. They never proved any link to Khalil, though they did note that he vanished right when their probe started. His name landed on a list of possible traitors, but without hard evidence, they left his relatives alone. The intelligence he delivered over those 2 years turned out to be worth a lot. Declassified notes say his information helped stop at least 7 planned attacks. It helped Israeli security forces detain more than 30 Hamas operatives, a sweep that hit the organization hard. The information flow also exposed how Hamas moved and stored money, cutting into their funding channels in ways that slowed their operations for many years. And in the end, Khalil received exactly what he had been told he would get. His brother underwent the medical treatment that kept him alive. Khalil himself was pulled out quietly, relocated without noise, and given a completely new identity in another country. He is likely still out there somewhere, living under a name no one can leak to him, with a history that cannot be traced back. The whole episode showed how far Mossad's recruitment methods had evolved. They spotted a weak point inside Hamas's courier chain. They followed a single courier with patience. They built a full picture of his habits, routines, fears, and obligations. They found the one personal issue that could move him. Then they carried out the approach inside a place where they had no official right to operate. Every part of the job depended on accuracy. If they had pushed Khalil even a little too hard, he would have pulled back. If they had offered him too little, he would have walked away. If they had failed to keep their promise about his brother's care, he would have shut down immediately. But they judged every step almost perfectly. They knew what mattered to Khalil. They knew how much pressure he could take and what he needed in return. They converted a courier who once served their enemy into one of their strongest intelligence sources. And they did it all inside Jordan, a place where Israeli intelligence work was officially banned. They tapped into hotel cameras from afar. They slipped in one officer under a cover story. They held the first conversation in a hotel room that had no active surveillance. They moved Khalil across the border without paperwork. They kept Jordanian officials out of it at every stage, which meant no diplomatic fallout. Jordan could truthfully claim they had no idea Israeli operatives were active in their territory. Everyone kept plausible deniability intact. This is how modern intelligence often works. It is not the movie version with speeding cars or dramatic shootouts. It is quiet observation, steady psychological pressure.
careful use of personal incentives, and long planning cycles. The people who run these operations invest months or even years preparing them. They gather every small detail. They watch and wait until the moment lines up. Then they act with care, finish the job, and slip away before anyone beyond a small circle notices. The story of Khalil's recruitment surfaced only much later, and even then only in partial form. A few retired officers hinted at pieces in memoirs. Reporters dug up fragments. Large parts of the operation remain locked away.
We still do not know Khalil's real name. We do not know where he ended up. We do not know the full scope of what he passed along or how many later missions relied on his reports. What is clear is that the operation became an example of how effective intelligence recruitment can look when it is planned well and carried out with discipline. They study how to pick a target, how to build enough leverage to get close, how to speak to someone in a place where you are not welcome, how to keep a source steady over long stretches, and how to pull them out when the risk becomes too much. Services in many countries review cases like this constantly. They fold these examples into their classes. They try to copy the same approach in their own fieldwork, because this is what real intelligence work looks like in practice. It is not loud clashes or fast acts of force. It is slow, steady pressure on people and on the small details that shape bigger outcomes. Khalil was only a courier inside the financial chain of Hamas. He was not a top figure. He was not drawing up plans for attacks. He moved funds and sent messages. Still, once Mossad brought him in, they gained a window into a whole layer of Hamas activity. That is the point of strong intelligence work. You locate one person in the right spot, and suddenly an entire structure becomes visible. You do not chase the chiefs at the top. They are guarded too tightly and bound too firmly to their cause. You go after the ones who keep things running, the ones who organize, who pass things along, who witness more than they realize, yet do not stand out enough to draw strict internal checks. Hamas learned something from all this, even though they never saw the full picture. After Khalil was gone and their system kept breaking down, they rebuilt their courier chain. They stopped repeating the same paths and familiar meeting points. They tightened the walls between different parts of their network. They watched their own people more closely. But by then, Mossad had already shifted to other approaches, because that is how this work moves. You use one method until it fails. Then you build another. You depend on one source until that source is exposed. Then you search for the next. You work your way into a network until that network adjusts. Then you look for a fresh angle. It goes on like that, step after step, each side adjusting to the last move. The shift that turned Khalil from a courier for Hamas into an asset for Mossad was only one fight in a long struggle, but it mattered. It proved that even in places where Israeli officers were not supposed to act, they still found paths to do what they needed to do. It proved that even strict, seasoned groups could be opened up at the right point. And it proved that sometimes the most useful information does not come from machines in the sky or complex code work. It comes from knowing how people think, what drives them, what scares them, and what keeps them loyal.
It comes from knowing how to press at just the right moment, in just the right way, so a person chooses the door you want them to walk through. That is what played out in that room in Amman when the Mossad officer faced Khalil. They knew what mattered to him. They knew he cared for his brother, and they used that truth to turn the situation in their favor. They realized he was terrified of ending up in a prison cell. They also knew he wasn't some hardened believer ready to give his life for a cause. He was a regular man who had joined Hamas for simple, everyday reasons, and those same kinds of reasons could pull him back out. That insight let them redirect him, turning him from someone working against them into someone working for them. They pushed him to think about staying alive, about protecting his family, about choosing a future instead of clinging to a group that would have thrown him away without a second thought if their roles were swapped. This is what real intelligence work looks like when it's done well. It's not flashy scenes or high-tech tools, it's quiet psychological pressure. It's watching and waiting. It's choosing the right moment. It's speaking in a way that makes a person shift their own thinking without realizing how it happened. And while we hardly ever hear about these moments, they go on constantly. Right now, in different places across the world, officers are studying people who might be useful. They're writing long profiles, digging for weaknesses, noting habits, and figuring out what might persuade someone to talk. They're planning meetings, rehearsing approaches, and deciding how to guide a conversation without making it obvious. Most of these efforts won't ever see daylight. They'll stay buried in classified files for many decades, maybe forever. But they're happening. In conference rooms, in hotel lobbies, in small shops, in busy cafes. Two people chatting might look like coworkers catching up, but one of them could be testing how far the other can be pushed. A simple business deal might be covering a quiet exchange of information. A person who seems like an ordinary neighbor might be passing small pieces of intelligence to a service operating far from home. Espionage hides in normal life, blending in so well that most people never notice. Stories like Khalil's show a slice of how this world actually functions. There are no fancy gadgets, no dramatic shootouts, no impossible stunts. Instead, there's slow observation, calculated pressure, and a deep understanding of human fear and desire. The people involved spend their careers learning how to read others, how to keep control of a situation, and how to pull someone over the line without making it feel forced. That's the real landscape of intelligence work. It's layered, quiet, and much more intricate than anything Hollywood usually portrays. In some ways, it's harsher. In others, more compelling, because it depends on real people making hard choices. And if you want to follow more stories like this, you can keep watching for them, because there's always another one waiting somewhere in the shadows.